It is 1 o'clock Central European time. It gives me great pleasure, even virtually, to welcome everybody to the World Sustainability Forum 2020. In the name of MDPI, Dr. Vasquez will formally open WSF 2020. Dr. Vasquez is an expert in life and health sciences, and before taking on numerous senior positions at MDPI, he worked academically at the universities of Lille and Basel. Since then, Frank has served at MDPI as Chief Scientific Officer, then Chief Executive Officer, and since 2019, again as Chief Scientific Officer. So, Frank, you have the honor to be the first of welcoming our international audience.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? So good afternoon. Good afternoon, dear participants, dear speakers, dear conference chairs, dear friends and colleagues. So it's really a great honor to welcome all of you to the 8th World Sustainability Forum on behalf of MDPI. Sustainability, as many of you know, has always been a central topic of the publishing and editing work that we do at MDPI. And to illustrate our commitment to a more sustainable world, MDPI has launched a number of journals to cover this area of research, like, just to cite a few: sustainability, energies, resources, for example. We have also launched a book series, like, for example, Frontiers in Sustainability, which is edited by Professor Bergman, or more recently, a book series entitled Transitioning to Sustainability, which will be made of 18 books, one for each of the 17 Sustainable Developmental Goals, and one volume dedicated to contextualization of the UN SDGs. We have also launched a few series of conferences to trigger live discussion and scientific exchanges around these important topics, like the present conference, the World Sustainability Forum. Another series, for example, is the Basel Sustainable Publishing Forum. And more recently, we just started the World Energies Forum to discuss very important topics. This edition of the World Sustainability Forum is, of course, a little bit special due to the COVID pandemic. And the conference was originally planned to be held physically in Geneva. But given the current context, we took the very difficult decision to run it entirely online. We strongly wanted to allow researchers around the world to still be able to share their ideas, concepts, research progress with their colleagues, and finally, without the negative costs of energetic cost of traveling around the world. So the latest editions of this conference took place in Basel, Cape Town, Beijing, but we can already foresee that online meetings will become more and more common in this world after the coronavirus. It's a first time for us to organize an online conference in this format with live presentations, recorded poster presentations, and we hope everything will run very well technically. So the conference will be made of keynotes, very nice keynotes this afternoon, presentations selected from abstracts, and also poster presentations, which give the opportunity to discuss with the poster presenters. So we hope you can attend these poster presentations also in the afternoon. So we look forward for very interesting discussions, debates around the most important issues relevant to sustainability. This afternoon will be also presented the 3rd World Sustainability Award and the 3rd Emerging Leader in Sustainability Award. So don't miss this important award ceremony. So I would also like to take this opportunity to address my really warm thank you on behalf of MDPI to the chairs of the conference, program manager, program committee, of course, the MDPI organizing team, and all of the participants for making this great event possible. So I want to finish by wishing you all really a great, fruitful, and successful conference. Thank you.
Very good. So we heard from MDPI, and we, of course, work very closely with MDPI. We, that is the academic world, many universities around the world. It has been a great pleasure to be closely partnered with MDPI, between MDPI and the University of Basel. But of course, there are many other national and international universities that partner with us. So in this sense, I have the great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Katharina Fromm, who will open WSF 2020 in the name of the conference chairs. Among many other positions and roles, she is Professor of Chemistry and Vice Rector of Research at the Université de Fribourg, outgoing President of Division 4 of the Swiss National Science Foundation, and a recent recipient of the highest EU award from Chemistry Europe, the Chemistry Europe Fellowship. Katharina, you have the honor of now defending academia in this adventurous project.
Thank you, Max. Let me share my screen with you, and hope this works. There we are. I wish you a good morning, a good day, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, wherever you are around the world watching us here. And of course, I would like to warmly welcome you. Warmly true, because here we have a very hot summer day in Switzerland. So welcome to the 8th World Sustainability Forum that is being held online, as we all noticed, due to the coronavirus. When we speak about a sustainability forum, of course, we are also thinking of sustainable development goals that we are all after somehow, and we try to realize these for our world of tomorrow. And especially today, in the context of the coronavirus, we of course have a lot of very strange situations in many of our countries where our normal lives have come to a stop. They have changed. People are thinking about what effect does this virus have, but also how can we start over? What can we do new in the future? And how can we better maybe reach these sustainable development goals that we all have around the world? So although there is a lot of harm, a lot of people that are ill, a lot of people that died of the coronavirus, we have seen also opportunities to change things for the future and to have a new start in many aspects. I was invited just 2 weeks ago at a meeting where I was to speak about energy transfer, the change in energy turnaround for sustainable energy sources and so on. And we came up that it's not sufficient to have excellent technologies and so on, but we also have to change our own lives, our own ways of living. And this is part of reaching these goals that we have set. Now, today, we will start into this conference with people from around the world who bring all the different aspects into the discussions, into their presentations, be it in the keynote lectures, invited lectures, or the poster presentations. And I hope that we can have a very fruitful and lively discussion around these subjects that are so important to us. Now, in today's program, the next speaker is actually a very good friend and colleague of mine, Professor Ed Constable. He was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, grew up in the UK and started his chemistry studies at St. Catherine's College in Oxford University. He, as it's written on his CV, fell in love not only with Catherine, but also with ruthenium chemistry and photochemistry, and obtained then in 1984 a university lectureship at Robinson College. In 1993, he moved to the University of Basel, which he left for a very short time to go to the University of Birmingham as head of school. And then he came back to Basel, where he became vice president for research as well. But he's also very active in the Swiss National Science Foundation, for instance, in all aspects of ethics. So he is not only a great chemist, but he's a great scientist in general, with all the aspects of politics, policy making that are involved here. And with this, thanks to Ed and to Max for being great chairs of this conference. Thanks to the MDPI team, which is setting up all this behind the scenes to make this work technically. And with this, I thank you all and hand over to Ed Constable. Have a great discussion, have a great conference.
Okay. Thank you, Katharina. And as Katharina said, my name is Ed Constable, and I'm one of the chairs of the 8th World Sustainability Forum, and I will be chairing the sessions this afternoon. Firstly, and most importantly, it is my pleasure and my honor to welcome all of you, the participants and speakers at the Sustainability Forum, to this unique event. Wherever you are in the world and whatever time of day it is, I'm glad that you can attend and share your valuable time and insights with us. And like Katharina, I wish you all good morning, good day, good evening, or good night. I believe that covers all of the possibilities. This event is very different from the one that we originally conceived, and I would like to take the opportunity to thank you all for your tolerance and understanding as the nature and the structure of the forum evolved dynamically and adapted to the new realities of a pandemic-dominated world. Until midsummer, we had hoped to be able to hold a hybrid event with both virtual attendance and local clusters with a physical presence. However, the changing situation made this impossible. And to quote from the poem To a Mouse by my fellow Scotsman Robert Burns, the best laid schemes o' mice and men gang after gley. In this context, I would especially like to pay tribute to the WSF Conference Secretariat and Technical Support Team for their resilience, their adaptability, their humor and tenacity in reacting to a situation and plans that often changed on a daily basis. Technically, we had originally planned to have 3 streams in this forum. However, we considered that the rapidly changing public health situation, together with the competing and more important demands on the time and skills of medical and public health professionals, made it more appropriate to move the medical stream to next year's event, the 9th World Sustainability Forum 2021. So I now move to this afternoon's program for those of us in Central Europe. The first day of this year's forum is concerned with the broader aspects of the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, and with honoring 2 established workers who share the World Sustainability Award and 2 younger researchers who share the Emerging Sustainability Award. It is a particular pleasure to recognize the achievements of these emerging talents in the area of sustainability. However, despite our rapidly changing plans, humankind is blessed with an adaptability, and we can use the turn of events in a positive manner, either with the silver lining of John Milton, that every cloud has a silver lining, or maybe with the more vox pop from Monty Python, always look on the bright side of life. In thinking about the modalities for this forum, we became increasingly aware of the dichotomy between a meeting on sustainability associated with participants traveling from all parts of the globe to a physical meeting. In this sense, we are proud that the 8th World Sustainability Forum is the most sustainable ever. More seriously, this event in microcosm encapsulates the emerging debate about the new normal. Politicians want to return to the old normal. But must we? Or should we? Or could we? This is a topic that will be hotly debated within this forum and in the wider political and social spheres. The theme for this afternoon is the Sustainable Development Goals. And the SDGs are truly remarkable as they encompass a vision in which a sustainable future is guaranteed through all aspects of human activity, ranging from hardcore science and economics in Goal 7, affordable and clean energy, through political action and motivation in Goal 5, gender equality, medical sciences in Goal 3, good health and well-being, through to social engineering and social engagement in Goal 17, partnerships to achieve the goals. I am not qualified to talk about the body politic or the involvement of the private sector in achieving the goals. But when I wear my hat as a scientist, as a chemist, and as an academic, I'm aware of how different disciplines from the humanities, from the social sciences, from the life sciences, from the medical sciences, and from the natural sciences must interact and understand one another to deliver the innovation and novel solutions that will be required. This is the topic of the second part of this short address and explains the title, Science Meets Sustainability, Friction or Fiction. I am a chemist who works actively in the area of designing and making new materials for application as sustainable energy and lighting technologies. When I look at the SDGs, I can easily see where my scientific expertise can have an impact. In the first instance, in the energy-related themes. At the same time, a more contemplative analysis of the SDGs shows how the 17 are interlinked and are synergistic. And it is this that brings me to my theme for the second part of this short presentation, a theme that is in part iconoclastic, in part contemplative. And I'd like to pose the question, are disciplinary monocultures counterproductive, or are they drivers of innovation? And I think we all have a discipline that we associate with, chemistry in my case, social sciences in the case of Professor Bergman. But do the mores and do the cultures within our disciplines sometimes actually work against the efforts that are needed to deliver the SDGs? The modern educational system is very much polarized, with the humanities and the sciences being a mutually exclusive, almost mutually exclusive, yin and yang. As an aside to my co-chairs, in particular, Professor Bergman, I should state that the social sciences find themselves in a gray area that was never envisaged between the black and the white of the Tajitu of the yin-yang. In reality, there is a lack of understanding of practices and methods between the arts and the sciences. A lack of understanding that can lead to a lack of trust. A lack of trust that can lead to a lack of interest. A lack of interest that dismisses the importance of alien disciplines. This is unfortunately not limited to the academic sphere, but is socially universal. As a chemist, I am constantly frustrated when watching television news stories. For example, an item about space exploration will be credited to a scientist, whereas one on the latest excavations in the Valley of the Kings will be attributed to a pre-classical archaeologist specializing in royal burials. It's a fact. Unfortunately, this is not the triumph of generalism over specialism, but more reflects the fact that every man has been taught that he or she does not understand science. This is a tragedy. It is also incorrect. It is my belief that our disciplines and our educational systems need to consider their positioning and their repositioning as we approach the discussions of the new normal. Today, academic management teams of universities, of technical high schools, of all institutions like to pride themselves on the multidisciplinary or the interdisciplinary or the transdisciplinary or the cross-disciplinary or the pluridisciplinary nature of their institutions. Unfortunately, these broad plaudits do not often reflect the internal reality. Institutions often have structures that actively discourage interactions across disciplines, especially at the early career stage. And we have to recognize that most active researchers are at their most creative at the earliest parts of their career. And so if we are to encourage a culture of cross-disciplinary research, then we have to be able to nurture it at the early stage of the career. The self-fulfilling nature of the educational system means that many scientists do not possess the broad background required to identify and to benefit from cross-boundary activities. This is either through inclination, which is completely acceptable, or through the monocultural expectations of their own discipline, perish or publish. No activity outside your mainstream is considered in promotion. Examples of these abound in the academic world. Of course, not everyone can and not everyone should work across disciplines. But to deliver the SDGs, we need to ensure that future cohorts are provided with the vocabulary and with the opportunity for such discourse, and that they find themselves in structures that are open and are permeable to discussions and collaborations between established disciplines. The concept of a polymath, or Renaissance man, to use a modern term, has not yet been embraced by the modern educational establishment, but it is exactly those talents that will be needed for the imaginative and for the innovative implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. In real terms, when I consider my own discipline, when I consider new materials for energy-related themes, I need to think beyond the functionality, beyond the chemistry, and consider the environmental, the economic, and the social impact. Taking a specific example from my field, the new wonder materials for solar energy conversion are called perovskites, but these are based on lead compounds. These materials are very efficient, but is that enough? What about the social acceptance of an element that has been demonized? What about the environmental and public health issues of introducing a toxic element into materials, into devices, which would be distributed worldwide and throughout society? These are questions that we have to be able to answer. I was thinking along this theme. In the 19th century, Ralph Waldo Emerson stated, if a man has good corn or wood to sell, or he can make better chairs or knives than anybody else, you will find a broad, hard-beaten road to his house. This is unfortunately probably no longer true. The corn must not be genetically modified. The wood must be organically grown. The chairs and the knives must not just be better, but must be very much better. And of course, the knife must be designed so that the user cannot cut him or herself. We think of modern universities as being in the Humboldtian tradition. And it is truly ironic that Alexander von Humboldt himself was a geographer, a naturalist, an explorer, a philosopher, and a scientist. His masterwork, Cosmos, attempted to unify diverse branches of scientific knowledge and culture. This aspect of the von Humboldt culture appears to have been lost in the modern monocultural disciplines of universities. However, this is exactly the approach that we need today if we are to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, I am not saying anything new or original. C.P. Snow initiated the discussion of the divergence of the arts and the sciences in the 1950s, in the last century, in his book, The Two Cultures and the Scientific Revolution. He maintained that science and the arts represented the intellectual life of the whole of Western society. And he commented that they had become two mutually exclusive cultures, and that the two cultures, instead of solving the world's problems, contributed to them. This is the friction of my title. I hope that in delivering the SDGs, we prove that that friction is actually a fiction. To conclude, we need to have genuinely integrated approaches between disciplines and specialities if we are to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. Looking at the titles of the presentations over the next 3 days, I'm filled with optimism. We are working in the right direction and finding pragmatic ways to circumvent the barriers that institutions and systems inadvertently create. I will come to an end now, but finally, I would like to take this opportunity to wish all of you a successful, a fruitful, rewarding, and successful forum, and to hope that you and your families remain safe and healthy in these difficult times. I will now make a transition into my role as chair of the afternoon session. And it is now my pleasure to hand the platform to Professor Joël Maison. Joël has been president of the ETH Zurich since the beginning of 2019, and we are honored to have the academic leader of one of the highest ranked universities in the world to open this forum. Joël is a physicist by training with an academic career including the ETH, the APFL in Switzerland, the ILL in France, the Paul Scherrer Institute in Switzerland, and the Argonne National Laboratory in the United States. Before taking his present role as president of the ETH, he was director of the Paul Scherrer Institute, and I can think of no more fitting person to give the next opening address at this forum. Joël, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you for the introduction. Nice to remind me a few interesting years. And thank you also for your presentation. Very interesting thoughts that you have put into your presentation. Dear participants, colleagues, and speakers, and also thank you for having me giving this opening statements. It's a great pleasure and honor to bring a few thoughts to your attention before you dive into 3 days of intensive exchange and dialogue, even if all this has to take place in a Corona-compatible Zoom environment. As I understand, September 2020 marks the 5th anniversary of the Agenda 2030 and the United Nations SDGs. Let's imagine 5 years in terms of a human life. We can envision a toddler and how she or he changes and whose future is still yet to come. We may ask ourselves, what kind of world will this young human being be living in, let's say 20, 30, 40 years from now? All of us here proceed from the base assumption that the next decades are still shapeable. Otherwise, you would not be here. And even if certain changes on our planet are already irreversible. But the challenge of living to our 5 years old, a planet worth living on is an enormous challenge. In the coming years, this will be an even larger challenge. So huge this challenge that it will require the effort of all of us to maneuver in the coming years whatever resources are still available towards decisive actions. So enormous is the challenge that it is not enough to point the finger at others or to seek blame for the mistakes of the past. So huge, after all, that only an alliance of civil society, politics, business, and science is capable of developing sustainable and resource-saving breakthroughs. Maybe sometimes I use the word that we would need a Marshall Plan for sustainability. That's the kind of effort that one should have in mind. With this in mind, I want in this address the following points. First, what can I contribute personally as a citizen, as a private individual, or in my profession? Second, dealing with complexity. Third, preparing the next generation. Fourth, universities as living labs. And fifth, seeking actively the dialogue with society. I think those are all points that we are addressing ourselves regularly. So let me come back to my first point. What can I personally contribute as a citizen, as a leader? The last few months have emphasized the importance of science worldwide, and have brought virologists and other experts into the media spotlight. In these times of great uncertainty, experts are in high demand to explain the mechanisms by which a pandemic spreads, to statistically analyze the development and to formulate possible scenarios with recommendations for our authorities and politicians. The past months also offered the public insight into how science works, with all the debate related, of course. The path to scientific knowledge is never straightforward, and the current state of knowledge is provisional, especially when, as in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, data is insufficient or still in development. Nevertheless, countries around the world have taken drastic measures and acted decisively in the face of rapidly increasing numbers of infections, of hospitalizations and deaths. In an initial phase, the containment of the virus had absolute priority, even at high economic costs. In the meantime, we have all come to realize that in the longer term, we can only overcome the health crisis if the economy recovers at the same time. Just want to remind everyone, well, I've been in managing the science position since now 12 years, so it's the second crisis I'm experiencing. And when jobs are at stake, then the environmental questions lose in priority. Prioritizing the environment over the economy, therefore, does not seem to be a valuable strategy with regard to the United Nations Agenda 2030. Rather, we must succeed in reconciling sustainability goals with a sound economy. The challenge is to decarbonize production and consumption, minimize our ecological footprint, and create the conditions for a world in which people can live in security and prosperity. I'm convinced that science has an important role to play in this transformation. All science. This brings me to my second point, dealing with complexity. Our connected and globalized world is both complex and fragile, as the COVID-19 crisis has just made us realize. Our cities groan under overloaded traffic systems. The deforestation of tropical forests has consequences for the global climate. Millions of people still do not have access to healthy and affordable food. The 17 SDGs show the breadth of the fields of action and indirectly the complexity associated with them. Universities are places where people are used to dealing with complexity and working together in an interdisciplinary way. Thanks to the scientific progress of the past centuries, we now have an impressive array of methods at our disposal, which we can analyze complex relationships in experiments, simulations, and model calculations in many different fields, such as physics, environmental science, or life science. Certainly, reality is always more complex than the model, but basic research creates a solid foundation on which new insight and ultimately innovation can emerge. Basic research, however, takes time. It often takes decades to achieve a breakthrough. So this is the kind of message I try to pass to politics constantly. Let me take a few examples that you know, but maybe more from the Zurich era. Solar cell technology, important for the energy transformation, is based, among other things, on Albert Einstein's theory of photoelectric effect, for which he received the Nobel Prize in 1921. If I would be nasty, I would say that he studied in a very good school. Guess which one? In terms of global warming, the first theoretical and experimental work on the influence of humans on climate change dates back to the 19th century, and the first calculations with climate models and future forecasts date back to the 1960s. Since the 90s, thousands of scientists worldwide, including researchers in all universities and research institutions in Switzerland, have been adding new pieces to the puzzle in various IPCC reports to improve our understanding of highly complex climate systems. With all the remaining uncertainties, we know much more today than we did half a century ago. Let me come to the next point, preparing the next generation. The British economist Keynes used the saying, in the long run, we are all dead. Well, this is clearly correct and undisputed. But even when we no longer live, future generations will live. So the sustainable development goals are about considering future generations. And universities have a considerable leverage here, which also gives hope. It is probably one of the noblest tasks of a university to educate talented young people, equipping them with the methodological and intellectual tools to help shape the world. Universities are not only training centers, but also educational institutions. Therefore, we expand at ETH our extracurricular offerings in order to promote critical and creative thinking. So this is something that was launched by my predecessor and by Sarah Springman, our rector, so that our students become responsible and entrepreneurial. As semester start, our universities come back to life. Actually, we had students back since the beginning of the week, and albeit due to Corona, combined by a number of protective measures and with painful adjustments to teaching and learning. At Zurich, at ETH Zurich alone, around 3,400 young people are taking up studies at the bachelor degree level. This is an increase of more than 7% compared to 2019, and which is, as a president, I'm not, of course, very proud of. Young people who study at the university or in a vocational training today want to shape their own future. The commitment of the climate youth since 2019, so there was a very strong world movement in that direction, also in Switzerland, is in this regard an encouraging sign that a generation is growing up here that wants to actively shape its world on a small, but also on a large scale. A few thoughts about universities as a living lab. Universities are privileged places for basic research, education, and training, but also for knowledge and technology transfer. New business ideas and cooperation with industry are crucial if we want to develop solutions related to the SDGs. Every year, between 20 and 25 new startups spun out of ETH research, bringing innovative technologies to the market. And what is interesting among them are an increasing number of startups featuring clean tech solutions, or social entrepreneurship. Various ETH spin-off, including Climeworks and Synelion, work with industry and technologies for sequestrating CO2 in the soil and on marketable solution for the production of climate-neutral kerosene. Other startups are developing alternative CO2-intensive cement production, for example. Universities are the best suited environment for living lives. On the ETH Zurich Hunkeberg campus, for example, we have built an energy network with underground storage that already saves 40% of CO2 emissions for heating and cooling. This was put into operation in the past year. It will make our campus almost CO2 free in the final stage of construction and investment. On the other side, our restaurant and campus have adapted their menu selection and taken measures to reduce food waste. And this is done in close collaboration with our students. Universities are not only agents of technological change, they are also affected by it. Continually questioning our goals, processes, and structures serves us well and helps us to develop as learning organization. If we want to stay competitive in the future, we need to go this way. And so at ETH, we have launched an initiative called Rethink, so RETH Inc., Rethink, where we have begun a participatory process to make our university fit to the future. I'm sure promising ideas are also maturing in your own universities, in your own countries. And universities bring us a step closer to the goal of a sustainable world. From this, I'm convinced. Last part, I want to talk about seeking actively the dialogue with society, and I know that almost each of you are engaged in this process. The point is that technology alone will not be sufficient to solve the challenge associated with the Agenda 2030. To be effective, technology must meet two important requirements, to my view. It must find a market, but also achieve societal acceptance. This is precisely why it is so important that university professors and researchers make greater efforts to engage in dialogue with society. In recent years, like many other universities, we have created a number of platforms to deepen this dialogue. One example among many is the Scientifica or Science Day event, which we regularly co-host with our neighbor, the University of Zurich. Through this and other such events, we are able to engage various stakeholder groups, politicians, public authorities, private citizens, to whom publicly funded universities are accountable. Now I will conclude my remarks. As I mentioned at the beginning, it takes the combined resources and intelligence of all of us to meet global challenges in an integrative way. This is probably very important this way, integrative. Nobody has to be left on the side. The world in 2020 is sending contradictory signals as to whether we will succeed in doing so in time. Even in the midst of a global pandemic, such positive energy came to light. I was really impressed to see how everyone at ETH acted in solidarity and became involved, shifting their normal research activities to address this recent threat that we just were experiencing. The world is too small not to do anything, and the problems are at the same time too big for only a few to solve. I hope that this conference will help us take further and concrete steps forward the realization of Agenda 2030. And with this, I will join Ed in wishing you a very fruitful conference. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Joelle. As always, an inspiring talk. I think we could theme the entire meeting around some of the questions that you have raised. And I'd like to thank you. I'd like to, of course, to wish the ETH the very best in achieving its goals in the context of the difficult scientific environment and the COVID-related research. Thank you again for this inspiring opening address.
Thank you.
Now, it is my particular pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Lydia Borrell-Damian, who I have also known for many years. Lydia is Secretary General at Science Europe, the association which represents the major public organizations that fund or perform excellent groundbreaking research in Europe. Like many of us, her academic career began in chemistry, in her case at the University of Barcelona. And after progressing her academic career at the Universities of Barcelona, Western Ontario, Pompeu Fabra, and the Universitat Politècnica de Catalunya, she moved towards research management and policy making. She has spent a long period as Director of Research and Innovation at the European Universities Association before moving to her present position at Science Europe. It is a pleasure to invite Lydia to give her presentation entitled Women in Science, which resonates perfectly with the Sustainable Development Goal number 5 of gender equality. Lydia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ed. I'll try to share my screen. I hope technology will be on my side. And I would just like to say that I am thrilled that you have selected me for to speak in this opening ceremony. And I would like to thank you very much, Ed, for your great effort in organizing this prestigious event. I would like to, for those wondering what I have in my background, it is a painting. That's a painting of my uncle. He is 90 years old and he switched to abstract painting a few weeks ago, actually. And you can't, of course, you can't appreciate his mastery, but you can certainly appreciate the richness of the colors. And to me, this symbolizes this proposal that Professor Joelle Mesot gave to us about this multilateral alliance, this multiplicity of colors that are needed to address the societal challenges, very nicely framed through the Sustainable Development Goals. I also would like to congratulate Ed for not only his scientific career, which is extensive, but also for working on these very important fields, not only chemistry, technology, science, which he, of course, he does that very well, but also all his efforts in research integrity. And I would like to highlight this as one of the main challenges that those in the research and innovation sector are facing today. My topic is not about research integrity, but it is linked somehow. I will speak about women in science, and I will speak about the contribution and the role of research in realizing the Sustainable Development Goals from a point of view of gender balance and beyond, as you will see. I will highlight, first of all, the importance of, the role of research, then the importance of women in science. What's the problem? I will illustrate this through several examples. The work that Science Europe, in close collaboration with its member organizations, national research funding and performing organizations are doing. What actions are they doing specifically? What kind of guidelines have we provided at European level? What kind of guidelines are we developing at global level? And I will put with a focus on the biases or possible biases in towards women in research assessment processes. I would like to end my my talk with a proposal about thinking intersectional. I will explain what that means, and I will launch a challenge to everybody. So I will concentrate my talk on the Sustainable Development Goal number 5 on gender diversity, that foresees an equalitarian world between men and women, and the empowering of women and especially girls, talking about the next generation in clear link to the previous presentation. Why is women in science an important topic? It goes beyond whether there are more or less science doing research. It really is at the core of the performance, of the performing of science. Let's take an example of a whiplash injury. Very not uncommon injury out of car accidents, sports, or another activity, unfortunate situations. Well, it seems that the likelihood of women to experience whiplash is considerably higher than in men. Yet, the anatomic models are scaled to men sizes, and the experimentation is done with those models. The models for women are just a scale down of the men models. Therefore, an open question is in order. Is it disappropriate to treat this injury in the case of women? There are very clear examples, and you have here a reference by Mordaka and others that concluded that these gender differences need to be clearly incorporated into the studies of this kind. This is just an example, but illustrates the importance of women in science. It is also important in social sciences, for example, where the views of men and women, be it in the research itself or in the application of the research results, can be perceived differently by each community. What's the problem? The problem, I'm sure you all know, starts very early. When you ask a child to draw a scientist, it is unlikely that you would get a picture like this on the screen. You will normally get the typical man dressed in a lab gown, probably with glasses, with some gadgets, performing some sort of creative invention. Well, of course, this image, it's slowly changing, but it affects all aspects of the gender diversity in the research sector, from childhood into even academic tenures or beyond. Think of research careers of women in industry, for example, which also is a tremendous problem. We have looked at the children, so how early it starts. Let's look at perhaps at another end. Let's look at the Nobel Prize winners. It's an historical perspective. First awarded in 1901. It has been given to 901 individuals, out of which only 51 are women. It is beyond the simpler gender ratio back then and now. It is really a matter of probably, at least we need to think about biases, how to judge excellence, regardless of any gender considerations. If we look at figures provided by OECD, these are figures from 2006. On the distribution of tertiary education students by field and sex, you would look at an overall figure that it perhaps is not that bad. But when you look at the proportion of male and female students in social sciences, journalism, or information, etc., is the first column on your left. You will see that there is a large, well, at least a majority of females. Well, when you look at engineering, manufacturing, when you look at natural sciences, you can see clearly a dominance of men. Health and welfare are fine. Arts or humanities, health and welfare, you have a majority of women. And so you have in the arts and humanities. But these are still clusters of disciplines, but still show that we can't play with overall figures. We need to look in detail what is happening and where. And talking about the where, here is an average distribution of female and male doctoral candidates, also from 2016, with an average that one would say that is not bad, as it shows a 48% of female doctoral candidates. However, when you look at the countries, you can see that it is far from being 48% really in all countries. Not only that, it is that then when you look at how many of these women get to a role of principal investigator, the figure is that in the end there is only 20%. Building also on this, and based on my former experience at the European University Association, where we had studies on women in the leadership of universities, we only found 8% of university rectors that were women. And of course, you would not be surprised to see that these were concentrated in the northern part of Europe, Sweden, Norway, with a little bit of UK, but they were all concentrated in countries that have had policies supporting the role of women in society for years. In Science Europe, we had a study as well on now looking into the assessment of research, so coming back to the research field. The percentage of publications for women and men, and we can see signs of improvement. If we look at the figures for 1999 to 2003, we can see that 29% of the publications came from women, while looking at the years 2014, 2018, we have 38% of women. So we hope that there is a trend here, and we hope that, in 5 years' time, or hopefully less, we would get to a figure that would be close to 50%. Finally, in this part, I would like to highlight the impact of COVID-19 in women in academia. In times of crisis, the traditional difficulties that women experienced based on the household, the larger proportion of dealing with household work, childcare, etc., has increased. Therefore, this is something, it's a call for research performing organizations, research funding organizations to consider these circumstances in the evaluations that probably will take place early next year or during next year, once the COVID-19 situation would be over, hopefully. But clearly, this is something that will have to be taken into account at the risk of running into very unfair treatment if it is not taken into account. Now I would like to move to the next part of my talk about the work of Science Europe on gender and diversity. I will often refer to Science Europe, but in fact I refer to Science Europe and its members. And what I will present to you is the collective knowledge gathered out of the practice that Science Europe members have adopted. So we had these practical guidelines to improve equality in research organizations back from 2017, where there were a series of overarching recommendations with the objectives to make institutions reflect on their own practices. And these guidelines invite institutional leaders to check the indicators that they are using in the success rates for men and women when they assess either research proposals for the allocation of funds or when they assess research records for the promotion of researchers. The guideline also encourage to have internal discussions within the organization to make people aware of gender and other biases. And note that I use the word people and not use the word men or the word women, because the responsibility is in all of us. It's in men and women. We are equally biased. Even women, we are biased as well. We are not trained to identify whether we are fairly or unfairly treated. We are assuming many things because these are cultural values embedded in us from early childhood. These guidelines also invite a reflection on raising awareness in the evaluation panels. That is in line with what I just said. Decision-making bodies, staff ratios, etc., on a regular basis, just to have a proper consideration to the topic. It is equally important to provide external training and not just internal discussions, ground-based expert knowledge to help the internal frictions, one of the frictions that Ed probably alluded to. Another invitation is to monitor the success rate of men and women applicants to detect any bias that has been overlooked. And also, very importantly, to learn from other organizations, in our case, Science Europe member organizations, but you will see in other explanations I will give you that there are other fora where you can learn about good practices in institutional settings. Science Europe also, together with its members, is an umbrella organization in the Global Research Council. The Global Research Council has an expert group, a working group, the gender working group, where we are represented. And it has a program of activities and development, particularly on harassment and bullying in research, sex and gender dimension, and monitoring equality, diversity, and inclusivity. We are contributing, we in Science Europe, we are contributing to the 3 lines, but especially we are contributing to the dimension in monitoring, as I will explain very shortly. Science Europe is also part of a community of practice. I think that the idea of community of practices, informal or virtual, are very good. In this, it's informal but structured. In this case, we are part of a community of practice that is called 4Gen. It's part of a big project funded by the European Commission that is called ACT on gender. And our community of practice is for funding organizations for gender. So it is a group of public research funding organizations that is taking care of how fairness is present in grants evaluations, in research, and how to deal with harassment and bullying. So 4Gen aims to develop a sustained community, hopefully beyond this project. We are committed to that. And especially we provide input on evaluations for grant allocation. Building on that, we just published a report early in summer out of a study conducted in 2019, where it was clear that institutionally, many organizations, many research funding organizations, many research performing organizations, and also building from my past of the university experience, also many universities do have policies in place. In this case, we found out that out of all the surveyed organizations, 82% had policies in place. And also others looked at not only gender, but very importantly, discipline, affiliation, seniority, ethnicity, disability. We talk about gender because it's perhaps the most visible of the challenges in diversity in research, but it's certainly not the only one. The recommendations we issued are aimed at organizations to make public the efforts, how they can publicly demonstrate that they address biases, discriminations, other forms of unfair treatment, that they should strive for appraise and reappraise and update in a kind of a continuous virtuous circle their anti-bias and anti-discrimination processes against the result of their assessment programs. They should equally strive to include diverse profiles, meaning gender diversity, ethnicity in the reviewer pools, panels, and boards. And they certainly can provide guidelines, trainings to ensure that everybody involved in assessment processes are properly trained to detect, monitor, and act on potential biases, discrimination, or unfair treatment in real time. This is really important, act in real time. So we hope that from the point of view of Science Europe, these recommendations will contribute to a fair assessment processes and promote equality in research funding. Science Europe will continue to work on gender and diversity. It will be still a priority. We believe that it is key for the good progress of research and for the good progress of the implementation of research outcomes in society. Now here's an invitation to start thinking differently. We need to go beyond gender, as I demonstrated in my previous slides. And I think it's key. I think it's time to think what I say intersectional. In this context, intersectionality is defined as the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as gender, race, and class, creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. The colors illustrate the need to integrate diversity in research. So I think that it is time to consider gender in a broader range of equally important biases and discriminations, and to recognize that there is a breadth of problems faced in relation to equality, diversity, and inclusivity. So my conclusion is that the onus is on all of us, as I said before, men and women equally. And my challenge to all of you is that next time, in the next World Sustainable Forum, I would like to see a man giving a presentation on gender equality. Thank you very much for your presentation and for your attention.
Well, thank you, Lydia, for your presentation. Very thought-provoking. I think that that will resonate with many in our audience today, and I think that the topic will be addressed in many of the discussions over the next 2 days. Thank you for an absolutely excellent presentation. So it now gives me very great pleasure to move to the final session in this opening ceremony, and it belongs to one of the prominent figures in Swiss environmental science, Dr. Janet Herring, who is director of EOAG, the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology. I only realized when I was preparing these short introductions that we do seem to be rather chemistry dominated. Her career also started in chemistry at Cornell and Harvard, but she saw the error of her ways and received her doctorate in oceanography from MIT. Her career has concentrated upon water quality and the speciation of metals in aqueous environments. She has held chairs at UCLA, California Institute of Technology, Caltech, and is currently Professor of Environmental Biogeochemistry at the ETH. Although Janet finds an obvious home in SDG 6, clean water and sanitation, she would also be welcomed in SDG 14, life below water, SDG 13, climate action, SDG 15, life on land, and probably even SDG 2, zero hunger. It therefore gives me very great pleasure to invite her to give her presentation entitled Communicating Applied Research to Achieve the SDGs. And I think all of the speakers so far have highlighted the need for communication. Janet, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ed, very much, also for the introduction and the invitation to participate in this meeting. I hope that everybody can see my slides. So basically, I think what we're going to see in the next coming days is that there are a lot of scientists who will be talking to each other, and of course this is will be very interesting for all of us. I would like to talk more about communicating research, and especially applied research, to a broader audience than the scientific community. I think this is really imperative if we're going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So what I'd like to do in this talk is to start with a little bit of motivation. Probably we don't need that so much, but I'll do it anyway. And then give one quick example of how this can work, and then talk a little bit about the mechanics of it, how to make it happen, ending again back with the motivation. So I think it's obvious to all of us, because we work in this field, that we have a lot of scientific knowledge that's very relevant to the SDGs and to sustainability in general. But at the same time, we have a fairly broad consensus opinion that we are not moving in fast enough or broadly enough to achieve the SDGs. The world is not on track. And I think that at least part of that is represents a failure to communicate our science effectively. It's certainly not all of it, but I think it's a part. So one thing to point out is that this is not at all a new problem. It is extremely common to have very long time lags between understanding the scientific basis of a particular problem and putting in place some policy actions to address it. So what you see here is that the time scale at the bottom axis here is in years, up to 140 years. And then we have a series of different environmental problems that have been addressed in various ways. And the poster child, the winner, is the ozone layer, with a mere 50 years between identifying the scientific basis for the problem and having a global level policy action. Of course, it takes more time, maybe another 50 years, before the actual harm or impact is reduced in a substantive way. And then we have a lot of other problems where you see this gap of hundreds of years, 100 years, between the development of the science and actual policy action or reduction of harm associated with that. So this is obviously the time frame that we want to shrink. We're talking between now, 2020 and 2030. If this is the kind of time lag we deal with, basically we're doomed. So if we think about this communication beyond the research community, it's important because that's where the decisions are being made. To put it very bluntly, the society needs to make decisions that involve complex scientific questions. We, as members of the society, benefit from informed decision making, And as beneficiaries of societal support for our science, we have some responsibility to provide our expertise to the public. At the same time, we're not in charge of making these decisions. Even on scientific or technical issues, societal decision making is not only about science. Science is presumably an important aspect of it. We hope it's an important aspect of it, but it is not the only thing. And it is neither the responsibility, or the right of scientists to make decisions for society. So let's look a little bit about AWOG's sort of ecosystem of applied projects. So we have this portfolio of applied projects here. And the one thing that I'd like to mention specifically on this slightly complicated diagram is that when we're interested in interacting with our stakeholders here, there are two very important ways to do that. One is that the stakeholders often fund these applied projects. They're interested enough to put their money on the table. And the other is how they receive the results. And this channel here, through trade publications and media outlets, this is really critical. It is very important that the communication goes through outlets that are actually of interest to the stakeholders, that we don't expect them to, for example, read the conventional scientific literature. In that regard, trade publications are very important, and you'll see an example of that very soon. So here's the one example that I hope might be illustrative. It's an example of micropollutants, which are contaminants present at relatively trace levels, but still have ecological impacts at those levels. And one source of micropollutants are wastewater treatment plants, wastewater effluent. And that's because the constituents in micropollutants are very often chemicals that are used in the home. That includes pharmaceuticals, drugs that we take. Sometimes they're pharmaceuticals, sometimes they're illicit drugs. And then also all these different chemicals that we use in the household all the time, different kinds of pesticides, cleaning agents, whatever they are. So these go into the wastewater treatment plant. In general, they're not removed very well, and then they come out. But it is possible to upgrade the treatment in order to remove those chemicals. And this is something that was studied at AWOG for a long time, and eventually did make its way into policy and practice. That's what's on this slide, and it's not really necessary, fortunately, to read all the details. The very important thing is on the left-hand side of the slide in red, and that's the time range. This starts, the first date is 1995. The last date here is 2014, which is when the Swiss Parliament came up with a way to finance the upgrading of wastewater treatment plants. That's almost 2 decades. And arguably, 2014 is only the beginning and not the end, because the implementation of this upgrading was anticipated to go on for the next 20 years. So this gives you a sense of, again, the time scale that is involved in a lot of these large-scale implementation issues. But let me show you 2 quick examples of really key elements of making this actually happen in this amount of time. One is a joint project with Practice, where experiments were run in a full-scale wastewater treatment plant at the wastewater treatment plant Kloten-Opfikon. So this is a major wastewater treatment plant for the Zurich area. The engineers from AWOG were allowed one of the full-scale trains in this treatment plant to run their experiments. And you see some results here. We don't need to go into the details. It's just, white high numbers are better than blue low numbers. And what happens with this kind of experiment is that you build an enormous level of confidence in the practicing engineers. They know this can work at full scale because they actually saw it work at full scale. They know what it costs because we can tell them how much we paid to make this happen. So this is different from something you would do in on a laboratory bench or even on a pilot scale. When you say costs associated with this, they're real costs. They're not extrapolated costs. And this is a very, very important factor. Another important factor is that there's a willingness to work with the wastewater treatment plant operators as they put this implementation into everyday use. The very first rollout of a full-scale treatment process was in the wastewater treatment plant in Neugut. Neugut is located 1.5 kilometers from Erla. This is no surprise. They know that if something goes wrong, somebody can be there very, very quickly to help them out with it. And they know that they can count on us to do that. And that type of cooperation is also critical for moving results from the research side to the practice side. So coming back to the communication part, if we think about communicating outside the research community, there are some key aspects to this. There's a target audience that could be media, it could be regulatory agencies, practitioners, politicians, public and public interest groups. These different groupings, they will have very variable knowledge about the system or the problems that you want to discuss with them. There are also venues for communication that's not so usual for the scientific community. Those are interviews, individual meetings, articles in trade journals or general publications, presentations to non-scientific groups, and participation on advisory boards and expert panels. And the goal here is really to inform the public debate and to provide the best possible scientific basis for decision making. And this note in red here, this is, I think, quite an important point. In general, scientists are not trained to do this. Some scientists have a natural talent for it, or natural interest, or aptitude. Some scientists go out of their way to gain this kind of training, but it is a bit naive to expect that anybody can walk out of their lab and be either comfortable or effective in this type of communication. So it's very important that people who are doing this are supported by their institutions, and we can come back to that later. I hope that there might be a little bit of discussion actually after this talk. So what I've done here is to try in each of these areas to point out some of the key differences between what we're used to, that's communicating within our own research communities, and what we're not used to, which is communicating outside our research communities. The audience, I've already mentioned this. We're used to talking to people who are specialists. We're used to talking with people who understand basically what we're saying, and this is simply not true when you try and speak outside the research community. You have to be willing and able to talk with non-experts. Then there's the goal. When we communicate inside the research community, if we're being noble and altruistic, our goal is to advance scientific knowledge. And very often we have a subsidiary goal to promote our individual careers. That's entirely normal. But these are not the goals of communicating outside the research community. The goals of communicating outside the research community is really to provide the scientific basis for informed decision making. And especially, it should not be linked to this individual career goal, because this can be absolutely deadly. Then there's a focus. Inside the research community, we delight in talking about the open questions and the areas where we disagree with each other. This is the fun part, right? This is the part that's interesting. It gets people excited. This is not the part that interests the general community. The general community finds that incredibly aggravating and annoying. The general community would like to know where the consensus is. And that is hard for us to step back to sometimes and to say, okay, we're not talking about the forefront, we're talking about the core. What do we all agree about? Then in terms of style, sometimes the style in the research community is a little bit hard to take. It can be very technical. We use a lot of jargon. There's a strong emphasis on the presentation and interpretation of data, right? So we really like to pour on the data. Sometimes we like to convince people we got the data in an extremely clever way. And then, later on, we might talk about the big picture. This is not going to work for general audience. In order for things to be accessible to a target audience, there has to be an emphasis on the overview and the big picture. And it has to really, the whole jargon, all that highly technical stuff, you have to let go of that. And then a couple of also key points. We're used to being in control of our message. And that's true. We present in a scientific conference, we write a paper, we control our message. And we're also very used to caring about the ownership of the contribution, the attribution. This is important, and we have to face this. It's our career. It's how we make our living. It has to be important to the scientific community. In contrast, when we go outside the scientific community, we lose a lot of control. The minute you speak to a reporter, that's it. It's out of your mouth, it's into their hands, right? You don't get to go back to it. I have to say, coming from the US, that I've been pleasantly surprised at how cooperative some Swiss journalists are, how they actually let you read through text in advance of publication, and you can actually even comment where you think something was misinterpreted or misstated. Sometimes they even change it. Generally, they don't let you see the headline, and you certainly don't get to change that, but you can't have everything. In the US, you absolutely never get to see anything, so forget it. But in general, the control is much, much less. And once it's gone from the first place it appears someplace else, then completely forget it, right? Then nobody even comes back to you to ask if there were mistakes. And then the second point is that there will be a lot of individual positions in science, but if those start to detract from the consensus and they start to just confuse the issue, it can be have rather negative consequences. So coming back to these, how to sort of develop these key points for communication, I think that it really makes sense to focus on the areas of consensus. Scientific information is most useful for decision making where there is consensus. Sometimes that's not possible, but we should at least try for that. And then the areas of disagreement or uncertainty, they need to be dealt with so they don't distract from the areas of consensus, but so they also help people to navigate this uncertainty. And I think that sometimes we do a disservice to the capacity of the general public to handle uncertainty. People handle uncertainty all the time, every day in their life, and especially politicians. They are used to uncertainty. They're not so used to the way that we as scientists talk about it, but we need to understand that uncertainty is not a crippling thing, but we have to address it in a way that is accessible and useful for the decision maker. Then I think and I hope that we can agree among ourselves that outcome and impact will be more important to us than ownership, so that even if our individual contributions are not recognized, that our brand is not stamped on it, that our institution might not be the one listed at the top of the page, that having outcome and impact is important enough to let that go. Communication outside the research community simply should not be about individual career development. And especially areas of disagreement should not be exploited for individual advantage. And then the accessibility thing, actually, I think that accessibility of information is also important within the scientific community. But sometimes scientists are willing to spend the time to slog through something that is badly written or has a lot of jargon because they really want the information. This is not true for most people. If the information is not accessible, it's just on to the next thing. And information simply cannot have impact if it is not understood. The burden of making the information accessible is on the communicator. It is not the job of the audience to understand. It is the job of the communicator to make the information understandable. So this is one example that captures a couple of those aspects. It's a celebration, 20th year anniversary of a sampling station on the Rhine River to look at contaminant pollution in the water. It's a project that has been performed with federal and cantonal authorities along with ERWAG, and also, although it does not show up here, with industry. And the important thing I want to present here is that when you have shared projects, you almost automatically have shared ownership. Then you have to make sure that all of those partners, or at least the ones who want to be, are identified with the project. Then you want to communicate it in a format and in a venue where it reaches your target audience. Target audience here are regulatory authorities and water suppliers, and the way to reach them is through the trade journal Aqua and Gas. And the way to reach them is to publish in the national languages and not in English. Right? And so these are, this takes time, it takes extra effort, but it's an important part of making these things happen. So we have to be also realistic that there are some pitfalls. There are some potential pitfalls of communicating outside the research community. It's not the safest thing in the whole world to do. It can lead to certain loss of credibility and reputation within our community. It might be, the perception might be that there's oversimplification. It might be a disparagement of popularization of science. Occasionally, there's a certain amount of envy of personal visibility. These things that we just have to understand and go into it with our eyes open. It's also possible that there would be a loss of credibility and reputation outside the research community, especially if there's any perception of infighting among the experts. And that's where this issue about consensus comes in. There could also be perception of favoritism or a seeking of personal advantage that is undesirable and makes a bad impression on the general public. And then there's potentially a perception of irrelevance if it seems that there's a focus of simply on detail and minutia at the expense of the big picture. So I'd like to present a couple of strategies for communication outside the research community, highlighting 3 out of these 4. The first one is knowing your audience. So this is a slide taken from a TED Talk by Per Espen Stoknes, and he was talking about climate change. I think he did a very nice job if you want to look at this. And one thing he pointed out is that a lot of information about climate change does not really get through to the audience. That in fact, the information is presented in a way that tends to alienate the audience rather than engaging them. And so he had this nice little diagram showing the climate news not even making it close to the target audience. And he suggested that there are ways around this, that there are ways in which you can make the audience an ally as opposed to an enemy. And he had a number of different approaches that I won't go into, but the key aspect of it is that if you want your audience member to do something, to take some action, to vote in a certain way, to change their behavior, they have to feel part of the activity. They can't feel threatened by it or abused by it or criticized by it. And that thinking about how to bring people into the story is perhaps an effective way to go forward. Another point I'd like to highlight is having a strategy for dealing with complex issues, because many of the issues that we want to convey are very complex. Here I've taken a slide from the IPCC. It's maybe not the most attractive one, but it shows a couple of very important things, is how to communicate the solidity of the understanding and evidence. And essentially, they defined a qualitative definition or a level of understanding based on whether there's a lot of evidence or only a little evidence, and based on whether there's a lot of agreement about the evidence or only low agreement about the evidence. And so it gives people a sense of where are you on this playing field. They also came up with some quantitative levels of confidence that they use systematically. So there's not a lot of different terms being used for the same things or the same term being used for different things, really trying to make it easy for the audience to understand a relatively complex situation. And then the last one here is staying on message. And the idea here is that when you're talking about a certain issue, it's very easy to get distracted. Right? Somebody might ask a problem that's only tangentially related, and you go off in that direction, you never come back. And so the idea here is that whatever your issue is, it stays in the middle, and whatever question comes up or criticism comes up, you try and bring it back to that issue in a number of ways, either by coming back to the problem that you're interested in, by coming back to the relevance of the problem over here, by coming back to the benefits of solving the problem, or by addressing what the possible solutions are, but not to let yourself go off into some weird tangent from which you will never return. So this is my next to last slide, and I'd just like to come back again to this point about the importance of scientific communication and the importance of reaching beyond the science bubble. I think all of us are used to hearing now that we tend, everybody, not just scientists, tend to self-segregate into communities with common opinions. And we do this sometimes in real life. These days we do it more and more online. But the problem with that is that we are constantly having our own opinion reinforced. We are constantly only speaking to people who agree with us. And that, to be honest, is really quite pleasant. The only problem is that it gives us absolutely no training or experience for talking to people who don't agree with us. And if we want to, again, to convey scientific information for a particular purpose within society, we are looking to expand the group that agree with us, not just to talk to the converted, not just to preach to the choir, but to preach to the sinners outside the church as well. And this comment, I think, is very telling. It's written about the United States, but I think it applies much more generally. And that is that we have in the scientific community, we have certain agendas and interests. And that is a real driver for science. It's a driver for science funding. And it is definitely possible that a vast number of people, not just in the United States, but in the world, that they are really not well served by those agendas and interests. And given that it's their money, it's not our money, I think we really need to consider how well we are serving the interests of the public at large. And so this is really my last slide. The point here is that there are many different aspects of sustainability. At this particular couple of days, we'll be talking a lot about food, and I think somewhat about water. But a critical element to this piece that I've put here in the center of this puzzle, is human welfare. If we don't link all of the different aspects of sustainability back to human welfare, in the end, we will probably not be successful. The number of people who care about the environment strictly for its own sake is simply not big enough to make the kind of changes that are needed. We need to really be convincing in arguing that the sustainability environment is critical to the welfare of the human population, and that in that way we have a chance really to make things better for people, the planet, and to go forward in a really cooperative way together. So I will stop there. And I hope that I did leave a little bit of time for some discussion.
Janet, thank you so much. You have demonstrated perfectly why we thought you were the perfect person to talk about communication of science. Now, just to prove I was listening, I distinctly heard you in the middle saying that you would be prepared to have a small discussion and questions. And for those who are not familiar with Zoom, there is a new box at the bottom of the screen labeled Q&A, in which you could put any urgent questions for Janet. I propose that we have a 10-minute question and answer session, and then we take a 10-minute break before the award ceremonies. So it's where the coffee break would be in a physical conference, and it's the bathroom break in a virtual conference. So I already see one, we have two questions there. Janet, I heard you say it is the role of the scientist to communicate to the audience and not for the audience to understand the communicator. And this is a question from Jafar Khan. Most of the time, the research is not understood by the audience. What do you say? Do you have a short answer to that?
So again, I think it depends what you're trying to get across. I think that a lot of times you can convey on a relatively intuitive level what the underlying phenomenon are that you think are important, and then link that up to a sort of big picture. I went to a talk once when I was teaching at Caltech, and the speaker got up and the first slide he showed was just covered with equations. And that was his introductory slide. And then every single slide after that was just covered with equations. And even though this talk was at Caltech, that was not very effective, right? So I don't think it's that hard to get people on board if you speak to them in a language that they understand, and if you communicate to them at a level that is accessible, that is sort of more intuitive, maybe a little bit less strictly theoretical or intellectual.
Thank you, Janet. I hope I wasn't giving that lecture. Okay, there is a question here from Anna Karina, which I think is a very relevant question. How can we improve the communication competencies of researchers? And do we already have important platforms and structures and communication platforms, or how could those be created and implemented?
Well, so I think there are really a lot of platforms. There are a lot of organizations and groups that are very interested in science communication. The Swiss National Science Foundation, for example, is very interested in this. The Swiss academies, and particularly Senat, are very interested in this. And I think that working with existing platforms is a very effective way to sort of multiply the payback from effort as opposed to creating parallel structures. I think one thing that is a little challenging with some of the more classical communications you often see coming from organizations is that it tends to be very one way. You know, we have a story, here it is, and less open to dialogue. I think it would be very interesting to explore the opportunities to have more dialogue around science. And there are, again, some efforts to do this. There's the organization REACH, which is all about dialogue. There are other local organizations. There's, again, I think the Swiss academies have a lot to offer there. And I think we should look around and see what there is and where we could benefit and grow what there is, as opposed to assuming from the beginning that there's a gap.
Thank you. Now there is a question which actually cuts across both your talk and Lydia's. I don't know if Lydia is still online, but it's from Mohammed Mahmoud Mohammed. And he says, let me try and paraphrase this, that it will be necessary to develop new styles of teaching and learning, especially under the circumstances of COVID, which may need to be geared towards the gender of the learner. And he comments, in some societies, especially in the Middle East and Africa, women do not get all of their rights to learning. And so the outreach to these groups must be addressed. I don't know if Lydia or Janet wants to kick off on that.
Sure, I can reply to that. Of course, he is pointing out the crucial problem. And here I would actually like to make a link with the proposal by Joel Mesot, saying that we need an alliance of critical stakeholders because this is an educational problem that needs to be tackled at government level. I think it is only through a top-down push as well that these policies more adapted to the reality of ladies can be developed. I also would like to make perhaps a broader reflection than that, and is a link to the neurological sciences, because they are, for the good and for the bad, for the good part, scrutinizing how our brain works. That means how our brain learns and how pedagogy in the learning process can be adapted to the way the different brains learn. So I think that it is a very challenging, also global challenge for education, is how can we use the discovery of the way we function for the good way of educating people.
Thank you. I believe we may hear a little more on that topic later this afternoon.
I'm sure.
So I'd just like to second what Lydia said, and also to say, I think we have learned how to deal with some things in dealing with the COVID emergency that are very positive. I've participated in a number of different online forums where people have been present, in a sense, from all over the world, and that would certainly just not have happened if everybody had to travel that far. And I think that's something that we can try and bring forward and perpetuate. Hopefully, as these tools become more widely available, they will also be more widely available to women in all different countries. I think that's, for me personally, that's one of the most promising factors that I think could get us over this hump to sustainability, is that we now really, for the first time, have a broader and broader and deeper participation of women in our society. I think this is going to make a huge difference. And certainly education is the first part of it, but only the first step.
Thank you both. I think we have time for one final question. And what I will do is take the liberty of trying to roll together 5 very, very similar questions, which address the communication of science in low to mid-income countries, where the scientific level of competency in the broader public is maybe lower than is familiar within high-income countries.
Okay, sorry. So I
that
think
ball is in your court.
I think one way to do this is to recognize the expertise that people do have wherever they are, whatever their community is, whatever their income level is. People have expertise in a lot of different things. Some of the ways in which people survive in low-income environments would certainly be extremely challenging to those of us who consider ourselves so scientifically informed and technically adept. In high-income countries. You throw us into one of those situations, we might not do so well. So if you start by appreciating the expertise that people have within their own context and relate whatever it is you're trying to communicate to that lived experience, then I think you have a chance to bring those people into the discussion in an effective way. It may require a different language, it may require different tools for communication, but I think you find a lot of savvy in low and middle income countries, people keeping things running. You know, cars from the 1960s and 70s are still running because people are fixing them. And this is a certain level of technical expertise that, you know, we don't necessarily have as individuals in a high income country.
Okay, thank you both for participating in that. There are many more questions here, but I think that we should now take a short break for for those who have been sitting in front of computer screens. So thank you. And now it's my pleasure to enter into the last formal session of the afternoon. And it is my pleasure, it's my honor to introduce the leading sustainability advocate, Matthijs Wachenagel. This seems to be an annual event in that I introduced him in Beijing last year. Matthijs is president of the Global Footprint Network, an international non-profit think tank focusing on developing and promoting metrics for sustainability. He started his career studying mechanical engineering at the ETH and received his doctorate in community and regional planning from the University of British Columbia. It was at this time that he developed the ecological footprint concept that he is well known for. He has worked on sustainability issues for organizations in Europe, Latin America, North America, Asia, and Australia, and has been director of the sustainability program at Redefining Progress in Oakland, California, and the Center of Sustainability Studies in Mexico. He has held positions at the universities of Wisconsin-Madison and Cornell. I had planned to read out his list of awards, but when I looked at it last night, I realized that he would only have 3 minutes left to speak if I did. So I will, if Matthijs is in agreement, skip the list of his numerous awards, which are a signal of his talent and his relevance to our world. But I will just remind the audience that Matthijs Wachenagel and Shifu Mi were the joint recipients of the World Sustainability Award in 2019. So it is now my great pleasure to invite Matthijs to give his presentation entitled, "Is the Future Already Present?" Question mark.
Thank you so much, Ed. It's a great pleasure to be with you all virtually. And let me see if I can share the screen here. Let me share the screen. I hope it's gonna, is it working? I think it's working. And I put the title on as well. Is the future already present? And the presentation could be very short. I could just say yes. But that probably is not satisfactory to all. I want to make the case a little bit more. That actually is about the narrative, how we hold the future. And I will make it very straightforward. Like here. Let's assume you're on a boat. We can see this little cloud there, you know, coming. You realize, oh, the boat is not doing very well. It has a hole. Oops, what shall we do? The storm is getting bigger. Very few would say, I will not fix my boat unless everybody else is fixing their boat first. Let's have an international conference to decide who should fix their boat so we can work against the storm. Now that seems to be a little absurd, but that's the underlying narrative in the climate and sustainability debate, that we do see a storm come, that we know much more about the future that we may want to know, and we still do as if we first have to agree with everybody before we fix our own boats. Now, where the analogy breaks down is that if you actually fix your own boat, if you all fix our boats, the storm will also be much, much weaker. There's no business case in just waiting. So this kind of this silly misconception. Why is that? Let me explain a little bit more why the future is present and why we know more about the future than we may want to acknowledge. But what we know about the future is the following. People will want to sleep in the future. They will want to eat in the future. They will want to be safe at home in the future. They will want to be able to move around in the future. And we also know that the future, whichever path we will take, will be much more defined by climate change and resource constraints. So given that, how does your boat need to look like for you to be successful? So the question is not so much, what can you do to save the planet? It's a nice question. But essentially, how do we need to shape up your boat so you can handle the storm? Now, why is this future already present? Just roughly speaking, this is a very simplified, obviously, view of the world, but in the very old days, human activities were quite small compared to the biosphere. Today, what some people call the Anthropocene, our shaping force of the biosphere has become the primary one. In fact, our demand has become so large that we nearly have kind of outgrown the planet. And what this means is not just, oh, it's a different situation, but actually the rules are changing, what's becoming valuable and what helps us to be successful is shifting. That's what I want to talk about today. And I'm going to start with something that is on people's mind, obviously. That's on people's mind, which is climate change. So there we have an interesting agreement. Paris was a miracle where we said, let's never get above 2 degrees Celsius, maybe 1.5 in warming compared to pre-industrial. And what does that actually mean? So IPCC already in 2014 said there's a 66% chance to not get over 2 degrees Celsius as long as we keep our greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere under 450 ppm CO2 equivalent. Now, the climate is very much like a fountain in some ways of the atmosphere. Greenhouse gases come in, they stay there, you know, and then they leave again, either through decaying for some greenhouse gases or sequestration of CO2 in other places, and that determines how much is in the atmosphere. Now, the question that is when 450 is the max, what actually are we having today? So as we said, the limit for Paris would be 450, and it gives us just a 66% chance to stay within 2 degrees. That's not a very good odd. I mean, if you go to Las Vegas to bet, it's like 66%. I mean, maybe it's you win more than not, but this is a game you want to win all the time, obviously. Where are we today? Now, the US government has an agency called NOAA. They measure that every day, and roughly today, we are over 500 ppm CO2 equivalent. So though some of you may recognize the lower number is actually higher than the upper number. So that means, wow, is there much budget left? That means we have overshot quite significantly, and that's just climate. So that's again an indication that the future is already here. Now, climate is just one of the pressures. Climate enables the biosphere to operate well, to regenerate. That's what we want from the biosphere as people, because the regeneration produces biomass that is the food for all animals, including us. And it's not just climate. We need to have biodiversity, the right nutrients. We have to have enough land and oceans. We have intact ozone layer. Don't have excessive pollution that also limits the ability or the availability of biomass, or polluted biomass may not be as useful for food. We need to have enough water. We need to avoid acidification, etc. So all these effects allow for regeneration. That's the outcome. To talk with like economists, these are the production factors, and then there's kind of what does it produce? It's regeneration. That's what it depends on. So the essence of regeneration, why regeneration is so significant, why it's the most significant resource that we have on the planet. It's the biological assets, essentially. But even fossil fuels, I mean, they're limited on the ground for sure, but even more limited they are by how much fossil fuels can be burned because of how much can be kept in the atmosphere or the atmosphere can tolerate. So fossil fuel also is limited by regeneration. And so is minerals, because minerals, there are plenty underground. I mean, it's also limited because the earth is only that big, but we could dig deeper, but that takes energy to concentrate, you know, so to dig holes and to concentrate, etc. So again, access to minerals also is limited ultimately, mostly by the regenerative ability of the planet. Now, let me show you how that looks. I don't know if you can see the video here. This is what we call biocapacity, or the regeneration of the planet. You can see it over the months, how it's distributed. So you can see the seasons, obviously in the winter. The biocapacity disappears, for example, in Europe, and in tropical areas like Yucatan, it stays about the same all through the year. So that's kind of the seasons, that's the income that we get. Now, let's put that into numbers. How much is that? Very simply, regeneration happens on the surface of the planet. And about 24% or a quarter of the surface of the planet is ecologically highly productive. That's where most of the regeneration takes place. The rest is like maybe deserts, high mountains, deep oceans, etc., not so productive. So that's what our budget is. So we have about 12 billion hectares of productive area, and you can then say, okay, for each hectare, on average, represent a 12.2 billionth of the productivity of the planet, an average hectare. That's what we use as the measurement unit. So a real hectare may be more productive or less productive. So that depends. Like if you have a twice as productive, or if you have a 3 times as productive hectare, that would be valued as 3 global hectares. That's a unit of measurement. So we can compare how much we have around the world in Costa Rica versus Switzerland versus Mali, etc. Now, how much nature do we have? That's what we just talked about. And the other question is, how much nature do we use? Like, how much do we use in comparison? So it's like an income versus expenditure approach, or we call it biocapacity versus ecological footprint. So these are the 2 arenas that you want to look at if you do ecological accounting. And yes, life is very cooperative. It's amazing. It's a miracle. But in the end, we compete for ecological productivity. For example, the seal competes with me for fish. So the fish that I eat, the seal cannot eat, vice versa. It's true as well. So we compete for ecological productive area, and that allows to do this accounting, because by looking at what are the mutually exclusive productive areas that are needed to provide what I want. So it's kind of the competition for that space with other species and with other people for all kinds of things, for food, fiber, timber. Obviously, as we build cities and roads on productive land, that's a competing use as well. And then we also need capacity to absorb the extra CO2 from fossil fuel if we don't want to have decumulation. These are all demands that compete for the same productive space. And what we see, that's what we call the ecological footprint, all the demands that compete for demand, we can put, that's also measured in global hectares. We can look at some key numbers. First is that actually the biologically productive space divided by number of people today gives us about 1.6 global hectares of ecologically productive space. That's for this year. When we do the same calculation for how much we demand for 2020, then it's about 2.5 global hectares. It's possible to use more than what we have, as it's possible to spend more money than we earn. It just doesn't work out too well in the long run. You cannot do that forever. That's kind of the point. It's possible for some time. So moving out of overshoot is inevitable. It's inevitable. The question is, are we doing it by design or by disaster? And in 2019, we used about 1.75-fold what we have. So kind of the footprint was 75% larger. Or you could say it's like using 1.75 Earth. And then you can compare that with how many Earths we have, and there's 1. But actually, it makes it a bit more complicated, because should we use the entire Earth? And we'll be talking about that, because other species need space as well. But by 2020, because of COVID, the demand actually reduced quite significantly, and we still use more than 1 planet. 1.56, that's probably an underestimate. We use about 15,000 data points per country and year. So the difference may be even larger. It's an underestimate, most likely. So it's like we use 1.56 Earth, but how many Earths would it be good to use? Now, it depends on how much biodiversity you want to keep around. E.O. Wilson did some studies with colleagues to say, actually, if we want to maintain about 85% of the biodiversity on the planet, we may only want to use half the budget. And so that shows that now at least we have a factor 3 difference in the metabolism of that we have currently, and what may be a stable metabolism that allows the biosphere to stay healthy. So that's the context we live in. We can also translate that context and say, what does it mean to use 1.56 Earth? We can translate that into time, and that's what we do with Earth Overshoot Day, because we can say very simply, from January 1st to which day have we used as much as the entire planet can renew in the year? And this year it fell on August 22nd. So up till August 22nd, we used as much as the entire planet can renew. People say, but on 23rd of August, you still had beer in my fridge. How is that possible? As I said, it's possible to overuse, but it means it comes from depletion. It's not coming from regeneration. We live off depletion. So that's when we have Earth Overshoot Day, and the battle call is how to move the date, because it makes our lives more secure. We have more resource security, obviously, if we can push out that date more effectively. Now, last year in an interview, Pope Francis even talked about it. We didn't brief him and said, oh, because last year it was actually on July 29th, because our use was more. He was shocked and said, wow, that's an emergency we should address. So it's interesting that he picked that up on his own. So let's look at the trend over time, and then I'm going to tell you more about why are we already living in the future. So this is over my lifetime, how much we have used compared to how much we have. If you use UN data sets, then then we can see like that from what they claim, from the productivity is going up, particularly in agriculture, that net biocapacity is actually on the increase slightly. And probably underestimate the depletion that's happening, etc. So even if you take this optimistic view, demand has increased much, much more rapidly, from using less than the planet when I was born in 62, to now using, as I said, more than what's available. And the green line, the dotted line, is E.O. Wilson's line of saying maybe we should just use half the capacity, leave others for other species. And that's the context in which we live. Now, how will that go into the future? I don't know. That's why I left it blank. We don't know how it's going to go. Will the trends just continue? But if you look at the pink area under the curves, that's the debt that is accumulating. And that debt alone has already led us to a situation where the atmosphere, for example, is saturated. I mean, not saturated in terms of climate change capabilities with greenhouse gases. So that's already a debt that is hard to stomach. And even if we follow the most aggressive path that IPCC projects and says to stay 1.5 compatible, which I'm not sure if it's really totally 1.5 degrees compatible, since we already have this high concentration in the atmosphere, but that's what they call 1.5 compatible, which probably requires a lot of net sequestration in the future, we will be adding significant more debt to the planet, even in this scenario. So what we know about the future is not that we want to sleep well and eat well, etc., but that we will live in a future of climate change and ecological constraints, of resource constraints. The question is how much of it. So there's no question we'd have to become regenerative overall. The question is how quickly do we get there? And by not getting there quickly, how much of the biocapacity budget do we burn? And now I want to translate the future into the present. Why is the future already present? It's a simple idea, you know, we don't know what the future will be like. Here I just made up some curves, but we know it's going to be rickety, no? And then we see COVID, how much it has actually started to wiggle the lines, and it's a price. I don't know what's going to happen. But what I do know is that things we invest today have a long life, for the better or worse. You know, so just as we build a road, it will be around for a long time. A windmill, a power plant, people being bored today, etc., all have long time spans. And the question for these assets is not so much how well have they performed in the past, but how well will they perform in the future? Will they be useful in the future that we can anticipate? Because the value of those assets, whether the market recognizes that now or not, is extremely determined by its context. If we build things that require cheap resources to operate, they will just not be that useful. And we will lose value. But those who can operate without the resources, like an energy efficient house or a zero energy house, for example, that will be extremely valuable in the future. And so also its net present value should be much higher. And if it is not higher, it means it's a huge investment opportunity today because the market misjudges the future. And so that's when you can invest well. So let me summarize this. Why is the future already in the present? Because what we build, the assets we already have, we will have in the future. Will they be valuable? The assets that we build today will be available in the future. Will they be valuable? So this is double risk, not just a question of whether our assets will be valuable or not. That's obviously a primary question, but perhaps even more important, the following. The loss of the value comes when the economy is frail. So it's not just that we lose value at the worst time when things are difficult. It's like falling down, and as you fall, people pull the mattress away under you. You know, so it's the double risk that becomes really dangerous. Why the present already reflects the future. We have done this thinking together with Schneider Electric, a large company, called it Strategies for One Planet Prosperity, because the choice is quite easy. Do we want one planet prosperity, or do we want one planet misery? It's very easy to choose, I would say, because the one planet is not going away. So what do we need to do to be successful? Whether that's for countries, cities, and companies. And I encourage you, you will see the link at the bottom. You don't see it very well, but I hope the PowerPoint will be made available so you can see it, or you can Google it, Strategies for One Planet Prosperity. It's on our website. Please look at it. The idea is very simple. It's to say companies that recognize the one planet context and that provide goods and services that enable humanity to thrive in that context, they will open their market because that's going to be used more and more. It's like playing soccer downhill. It's going to help those companies more likely to be successful. And in difference to soccer games, it's a game that everybody can win. It's not just one team wins, but actually the more win, the more win. With that, I would like to close. Hope I stayed within time. If you want to know more about the data, data.footprintnetwork.org shows you the various performances of countries. If you have questions, don't hesitate to contact me as well. And I'm sure there may be some questions as well, and I'm happy to answer them now and later by email if there's more questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, as always, thanks for a wonderful presentation, Mattis. I'm slightly conscious on time, but if there are one or two urgent questions, please post them in the Q&A. And while there's a question here. It seems that lifestyle changes are key for the transition as it relates to changes in multiple key sectors as accounted in the ecological footprint. Is there, or do you think it is important in the synergies and the nexus of changes such as mobility and food?
Absolutely. So when we say, how do we move the date? We have to do this slogan. We use the hand and we write right here, move the date. And it's basically 5 big factors that have all huge opportunities to improve our situation. They have opportunities to make our lives better. The thumb represents how much we have available, a healthy planet, so regenerative agriculture, conservation, restoration, etc. That's in this thumb. That's supply. Demand, it's kind of the footprint, has 4 big axes that also have huge opportunities. How do we build our cities? That really determines to a large extent, you know, how much mobility we need, how we heat and cool houses, etc. So cities shape the way we live. How do we power them at the energy system with coal power or solar energy? How do we feed ourselves? About half of the biocapacity of the planet already today is used for feeding people. And then obviously, how many are we? And if we double as many people, there's only half as much planet per person. These are mathematical and kind of shaping the difference between how much we have and how much we use. And the good news is actually economically and technologically, the sustainability options are much better. I think if we're just stuck in a narrative, that's a noble narrative where we think, oh, it's so noble to do sustainability, must be more expensive. But actually having assets, that's what I tried to say, that are not fit for the future is economically the most devastating thing. So economics is on our side and technologically it's possible as well.
Okay, thanks, Mattis. Thanks again, as always, for a stimulating, fantastic, thought-provoking presentation. So now I will formally bring the sessions this afternoon to an end, mainly because everybody has seen and heard too much of me, and we now break out into the poster presentations. I would like to thank, from my part, all of the speakers this afternoon, all of the awardees this afternoon for their fantastic contributions. I'd like to thank the attendees for their contributions. And now I give the word to, I think, Professor Bergman to tell you the technological magic that is about to happen.